Ms. Parker, the Vice Chair.
Present.
Mr. Edwards. Mrs. Roberts.
Here.
Commissioner Smith. Mr. Tripp.
Here.
Dr. Marshall.
Here.
And there's also present in the room the Chair, Ms. McDevitt, Mr. Martin, and Dr. Solano.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mikey. We have one.
We have quorum.
Okay. In your package.
Here comes Commissioner Smith.
And Commissioner Smith and
Governor
Stavros have just joined us.
All right. Wonderful. Let me start out by saying we only have one agenda item this morning, and that is our policy statement with regard to differential tuition and how we're going to handle particularly the financial aid component of the differential tuition. Now, I'm hearing an echo. Let's see. Am I echoing to you? Yeah.
There's a bit of an echo.
Okay. Let me see if I can do something here. Is that better? No?
Frank, it's a little better, but it's...
Actually, it's a little better. Okay, then we'll do it this way. If you take a look in your red packets, you should have the revised language that we've been working on for several weeks with Dan and a lot of input from the universities and financial aid officers across the state. I just want to recap for a minute because it's important that we understand what it is we're trying to do. The tuition differential legislation that passed, as we all know, and frankly enthusiastically supported, does require that 30% of the revenue from the need-based aid be used to focus on need-based financial aid. So 30% of the tuition revenue has to be spent on need-based financial aid. Many of us have expressed desires through staff and others, have expressed a strong desire to be able to monitor and make certain that 30% of revenue actually goes to need-based financial aid as an enhancement as opposed to supplanting existing financial aid for one reason or another. Particularly because we feel it's our obligation to the legislature who adopted it with those representations and the students who are paying it. So we're trying through this policy, and let me add, we'll adopt a policy this morning and at the board meeting, and we'll then direct staff to go out and continue to draft regulations relating to this policy. So we're drafting the broad policy, but we're committed to try to balance appropriate and predictable funding with affordability and access, and it's a constant struggle. But I think particularly with this piece of legislation, the first go-around with differential tuition, setting the tone for how we're going to monitor and review and ensure that 30% of differential revenue goes to financial aid, we need to follow the letter and the intent of the statute here and be a little more exacting, perhaps, than some would like. We're going to, in this policy, do a couple of things. And again, if you look into your policy, into your red folders, you should have the revised draft. Now, I don't know, those on the phone, were they emailed? Dan?
Yeah, I'm here.
No, those that were on the telephone, did we get the new policy emailed to them?
I did not receive it.
I don't have the new policy.
No, they were not.
Okay. Well, what we could do, we'll just talk through some of these changes. It's a broad policy, and then perhaps before the board meeting, we can find a way to email those to the board members who are on the committee who have not had the opportunity to view it. But in general, the first policy, particularly the one that went out in the packet, was very restrictive, and we received a lot of response and feedback during the process over the last week or so from universities and some governors. So we, just in the last day or two, revised some of that language. To summarize the policy that's in front of you, number one, universities will be required to increase their undergraduate need-based aid over the prior year by 30% of the tuition differential revenue. That's clearly in the statutes. one of the changes in the policy that's in front of you today, as opposed to the one that went out in the mail, is that we are providing for a reasonable accounting test for the supplanting of funds. Again, it's a concern that it could simply happen, that if funds don't make their way to financial aid for one reason or another, that the 30% from the differential tuition revenue doesn't in fact enhance. So what we're asking for, and what we will direct staff to draft, is to, in the event that a university does not increase undergraduate need-based aid by at least as much as 30% of the tuition differential revenue over the prior year, that they account to the board as to why. There'll be probably, and I'll frankly expect, a great deal of documentation to indicate why particular financial aid accounts were smaller 1 year under the prior year's accounts. There are various sources of financial aid funding, and if one of those sources goes small, no action of the university, lower enrollment, cuts from the state, things of that nature, many universities rightfully complain that they should not have to supplement that financial aid with additional revenues before being able to access the tuition differential financial aid. And I think that was a fair comment. So there will be several tests, and staff will draft regulations to ensure that if that occurs, if there is a reduction in financial aid dollars, the universities may still be in compliance with the statute and whatever regulation we ultimately adopt. However, they're going to have to provide substantial documentation explaining why and what happened and showing us the math, frankly. Number two in the new policy requires universities to maintain the tuition differential funded financial aid dollars in a separate account just for clear purposes of our tracking. We'll see dollars in and dollars out, so it just doesn't get intermingled. We talked to many of the universities about that, staff did, and most universities were very comfortable. In fact, many universities were already doing that for purposes of their own internal accounting and proving that the tuition differential dollars were used as required by the legislature. So those are the two new provisions, or the two revised provisions contained within the policy. And let's talk about those first before we get to an additional issue that was contained within the policy that we pulled out, but that I really would like us to talk about in just a little bit. Are there any questions or concerns with regard to the language, or the concepts at least, that we talked about requiring a thorough explanation to the Board of Governors in the event that university funding for financial aid decreases year to year, or should we just trust what we're told, I guess?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Yes, Ava.
It should always be based on the previous year. I mean, is there any way, I guess, pardon my ignorance, or this is, I know, a fundamental question, I missed talking to Dan, but is it that, was it impossible to base it on the current year, or is it always understood that you're going to look at what the previous year, I guess the previous year of revenue was, and then 30% over that, 30% of that for need-based aid? So is it always going to be like, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I believe it's based upon the previous year's funding of need-based financial aid. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the study is whatever the previous year's funding was from whatever sources, be they state dollars or foundation transfers. We take a snapshot this year and say this was your baseline. Next year it needs to be baseline plus 30% of the differential tuition revenue. And if it's not that, then explain to us why the other component, not the need-based tuition revenue, but the other component is less. Has there been a substantial change? Has there been a cut that was beyond your control? So it comes year-to-year snapshot, which should be year one plus 30% of the new revenue. If it's not that, what we're saying is tell us why and give us numbers.
Tico, this is Dan Cohen-Vogel.
Excuse me, I have a question. It's Stan. Somebody then has to step in as a Board of Governors or the Chancellor's office and make a judgment call when a university submits that information. Who will do that?
Well, that will be our committee, and we're going to have to review that, particularly coming into the prior year, into the subsequent year, when the university comes back and asks for more differential tuition in the subsequent years. And we've got to account to the legislature that these funds went there, and if we can't do that, we would be hard-pressed to receive requests for approval of additional differential tuition if those funds are not being spent as required by statute. So it would be the Budget Committee, my understanding, unless Madam Chair would have another plan.
This is Norm Tripp. I talked with Derry, and I think under the compliance part of audit and compliance, that we would be looking at that too.
I have no doubt, Governor Tripp, that you all and Barry Harper would pay attention to those numbers. I think I'd probably want to keep a lot of it in Dan Cohen-Vogel's house to make certain the reporting occurs that we're able to set up and track. But I think if audit wanted to put eyes on it, I think we can't be too over-analytical, particularly in these first years as we set the tone and establish the baselines on how we're going to measure these things. We have an opportunity here where the legislature has said, this is what we want done, Board of Governors implement. And I think we need to be very cautious to make certain that we implement the intent as well as the letter of their law.
Yeah. We wouldn't be setting, we would only be tracking, Tico, after whatever policy budget sets, we would just be looking at that through the compliance part with all the universities to make sure that we feel that there's a compliance with what the Budget Committee has set.
Sure. And Norm, I think that would be a great backup. And I appreciate Gary putting that one on top of his plate as well, and yours. So thanks for that. Any other questions or issues? Just on the broad policies and the way that they're described in there, which is the 30% must be allocated. That's statutory language. We don't have options there. And maintaining funds in a different account. Okay, if not, let me move to the final topic, which I have some interest in. You all may not, so let's just put it on the table and talk about it. I've been a little concerned that the legislative intent, I believe, directs universities to attempt to spread that differential tuition revenue to more and more students, perhaps more than otherwise it would be spread to, so that all need-based students, or as many as possible, would receive the benefit of this additional 30%. My philosophy around that additional 30% was that it was meant to assuage the costs of the tuition increase on the need-based students. One of the early drafts of this language essentially said no student would receive more need-based financial aid from this differential piece than they paid in that differential tuition increase until every student had received a piece of need-based financial aid. In other words, it was cost to attend. First it was cost that they spent. Then I had scaled it back to say no student would receive more than the cost to attend the universities.
No, I think that there's a streaming problem here.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I thought someone had a question. And after pushback from various sides, we've pulled out that language, but I want to engage the conversation at least to determine whether or not there should be whether or not the board feels that there should be some cap on a per-student basis in order to broaden or spread the financial aid benefit to the students who are paying the increased tuition, or whether we think we should let the universities continue along their standard process, indicate to us in the reports how many students receive need-based financial aid vis-a-vis those who are eligible for it, and then take a look at that issue in subsequent years. If the universities are spreading that additional revenue out in such a way that works without overburdening them, perhaps that's fine. I just want to make certain that our message is clear, that we anticipate and at least I believe legislative intent was that of this 30%, a deal of it would go to be spread amongst all the need-based students to assuage the pain. And I'd love to have some conversation on that.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask or make a comment? My understanding, and I'm not familiar with the language that you referenced that was in an earlier draft, and I'm not really concerned with it because that's not what the law is. But I gave testimony on this multiple times during the session, and what I have always thought we were trying to do with this 30% is to be able to provide some flexibility in the nature of the need-based aid programs that we are going to provide at the university system, because right now all of the mandated programs have criteria, and there isn't any need-based aid program available for people who are not quite that bad off, but who also need some help. And so these were the kinds of things that we talked about with respect to utilization of the 30%. And there was never any intention that this 30% be over and above a base amount that happened the prior year if, in fact, something went wrong that reduced those dollars. These folks were not supposed to be making up dollars that were not either appropriated, gotten through enrollment, or lost because of portfolio declination due to the market. And so I'm kind of at a little bit of a loss with this conversation. I mean, I'm all for your goal, which is to get as much into need-based aid as we possibly can and to try to enhance our programs. And I would do everything to encourage our universities to do that, and I think they all probably feel the same way. But the idea here is that you're supposed to put 30% of that tuition differential or an equivalent amount from another source, and if it does not increase over the prior year, then you need to explain why. And that's
what the first provision says, Madam Chair.
I understand.
The language that we talked about just at the beginning simply says separate 30% into a need-based account, and then if your other revenue sources are lower, you may still be in compliance. You just have to tell us why and show us the numbers.
Right.
That's exactly what this new draft of the policy does.
I agree.
We heard your comments and thought they had a great deal of merit, so that it was changed. And that's the draft in front of you. Does exactly what you're saying. The conversation I'm trying to drive to now is, as we look at use of those funds, of that 30%, notwithstanding the total amount that's being spent, we're presuming the universities are now in compliance. The question becomes, of that 30%, and frankly I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, it's my belief that a portion of the legislative intent was also to broaden the scope of those funds, or to use that 30% as widely as possible. In other words, not giving one student $10,000 of this money and having 5 students not receive any additional financial aid. So what I'm trying to determine, or the conversation I'm trying to have, is whether or not there should be a dollar cap on the amount of need-based financial aid from this pool that can go to any one particular student, whether or not we should at least track how many students were served with that need-based financial aid, with a report of what the average grant was or the median grant was out of that pool. Just some mechanism, some tool to tell us how many new folks or how many folks were served from that money and how broadly was it spread. That's the final piece, but I absolutely agree with your first thoughts, and that's why we changed the policy over the last 2 weeks.
Kiko, this is John Delaney. Would it sort of satisfy your interest maybe to assess it at the end of a year? One of the concerns is just the paperwork to track all of these things and come up with a format to report them in a responsible way. And again, I think each institution is delighted to provide as much need-based aid as possible, but there already is going to be some complicated record keeping to make sure that the auditors are satisfied with how this money is directed.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all, Mr. President, and I don't want to overburden, but I think what I would be asking for is if the board saw fit to say this number is the numerical cap, no one gets more, or in the alternative, if the board were just to say, tell us how many checks you wrote and tell us what the median of that check was. I think that's overburdensome.
This is Norman Tripp. I would lean more, Tico, towards letting the university boards of trustees, as long as the additional funds are there according to the policy that you did in item 1 and 2, letting them deal with how they put these funds out among their students, because I don't think we've seen any trend of the universities and their boards of trustees not being really aware of the need for this additional aid. I don't know that we need to hand feed them or direct them to specifically how they have to do it. And I kind of like what Sheila said was that, it's an extra source of funds, but give them the flexibility within their university to be able to apply these funds to the needs of the students as they see them. And then we can look at, in the report that we're going to talk about in strategic planning, that University Compact, we will see the results of what they're doing. And if we see a trend going one way or another, then I think we could speak to it. That would be my hope.
Okay.
Tico, it's Carolyn Roberts. Just for the record, I agree with Governor Tripp.
Tico, I think it would be appropriate to have a statement in our policy that does say that we encourage the universities to be flexible and to expand the pool of applicants, or however you would word it, to get to the point that you're making.
And Madam Chair, that's probably enough. I mean, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to engage in this conversation. I want to make sure that the sense of the board, it's always for the language.
But I mean, without telling them how to do it, I don't think we want to tell them how to do it, but just say that, we would hope that we encourage flexibility and innovation and creativity in how they distribute this money.
And I can certainly live with that if we add on and we would just like an additional line of a report that says, and here's the number of dollars that were given and here's how many students received it.
I'm sure that. Any reason y'all can't do that? I think you probably have to report who gets it anyway, so you know.
Yeah, it's a separate account. I mean, I don't think this is asking a great deal.
Mr. Chairman, I'm certainly interested in having those two questions answered. I think that's, I don't need to get into details of, making caps or deciding how much or what financial position it should be in, but I am interested in knowing how many were helped and how much money went out. I don't think that's too cumbersome for a university to just provide the answer to those two questions.
Is there any objection to that approach? Okay. Any other thoughts, issues, concerns? Dan, did I leave anything out on the policy discussion?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. What I'd like us to do, if there's no additional conversation, is adopt this broad policy now, which is basically the language in your packet in the red folder, which simply has the two bolded phrases with the language underneath, and then the note language, we will pull that from your policy statement and simply include a statement that says that universities will account to the Board of Governors on the full amount of differential tuition granted to students, and the median grant, if you will, and the total number of students served by the additional differential tuition financial aid. Any objection to that language? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion then to adopt the policy as I just described it?
Norman Tripp, so moved.
Second.
Thank you, Madam Chairman Roberts. Any additional questions, comments? All right, seeing none, then I'll call the question. All in favor of adopting the policy as stated, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Madam Chair, we'll report this policy out to the board at the board meeting, and at that point we will ask the full board to adopt the policy and instruct staff to work with us to prepare the regulations under this policy, which of course is where the details will be, and bring those back to the board at the next meeting.
Okay.
Is there any other business to come before the committee? Seeing none, Madam Chair, we are adjourned.